Everything you think you know about Spartan warriors comes from legend, propaganda, or Hollywood. But the real Spartans, the ones who stood with Leonidas, were far harsher, more political, and more complex than the myth of perfect warriors ever admits. For most people today, Sparta lives more in cinema than in history. Films, comics, and pop culture turned Leonidas and his warriors into near-superhuman fighters, stripped to the waist, roaring in slow motion as if battle were pure instinct and rage. Ancient Greek writers helped build this image long before Hollywood, using Spartans as symbols, either of terrifying discipline or of idealized, almost inhuman courage. Their accounts mixed admiration, rivalry, and propaganda, and modern audiences often mistake those carefully crafted stories for literal truth. But the real Spartan warriors were not mythical action heroes. They were citizen soldiers shaped by one of the most rigid societies the ancient world ever produced, men whose lives were controlled from childhood to death by a state obsessed with survival and dominance. They farmed, voted, conspired, married, and argued in assemblies, all while resting on a brutal system of oppression over the helot population that did most of the actual labor. The warrior of Thermopylae was not just a fighter, he was also the product of politics, economics, fear, and constant training. Understanding the truth about Sparta matters because it reveals how a legendary warrior culture really worked from the inside. Behind the red cloaks and lambda shields stood a system that was efficient, ruthless, and deeply human in its contradictions: courage and cruelty, honor and brutality, discipline and paranoia. By peeling away the layers of legend, it becomes possible to see how Spartan power was built, how it functioned, and why it ultimately collapsed, not as a myth of perfection, but as a real society with limits and flaws. If you want to dive beyond the movie version and uncover the actual history of Leonidas's warriors, make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and comment which city you're watching from, because in the next chapter, we go back to a time before Sparta was even known as a land of perfect warriors. Long before Sparta became a symbol of pure warrior culture, it was simply one among several Greek communities in the southern Peloponnese, rooted in the fertile region of Laconia. Early Sparta emerged from the unification of several villages in the Eurotas Valley, gradually forming a single polis whose power rested on control of land and river. In this first phase, Spartans were not yet the uniquely militarized society of later fame. They were landowners, farmers, and aristocrats competing with neighboring communities for resources and influence. Their identity was still fluid, more regional than legendary, and their institutions had not yet hardened into the rigid system that would later astonish the Greek world. The arrival and dominance of Dorian Greeks played a key role in shaping Spartan self-perception. In later tradition, Spartans saw themselves as Dorian conquerors who had displaced or subordinated earlier populations in Laconia. This Dorian identity fed into a sense of being tougher, simpler, and more warlike than softer Ionians or other Greeks. But at first, it was as much a cultural label as a military reality. The Dorian dialect, customs, and aristocratic warrior ideals formed a background ethos rather than a fully developed state ideology. Only later would Sparta convert this sense of difference into a total lifestyle built around arms and discipline. Before that transformation, Sparta's relations with its neighbors were complex and not purely militaristic. The Spartans interacted with other Laconian communities, trading, negotiating, and occasionally fighting, like any other Greek city-state in formation. They established relationships with Arcadian and Argive neighbors, sometimes as rivals, sometimes as uneasy partners. Warfare existed, but it was episodic and limited. Seasonal campaigns and small-scale raids fit into a broader pattern of regional competition rather than permanent mobilization. Sparta was assertive and ambitious, but not yet the relentless military machine later authors described. The turning point came with the Messenian Wars, a series of brutal conflicts against the people of Messenia to the west. These wars were not typical Greek skirmishes. They were long, hard struggles for land and labor. When Sparta finally subdued Messenia, it gained not just territory, but an entire population reduced to helot status, effectively state-owned serfs tied to the land. This victory created enormous wealth and security for Spartan landowners, but also a permanent internal threat, a huge, resentful subject population that vastly outnumbered its masters. From that moment, Sparta could never again afford to be a normal city-state. To hold down the helots required something new, a permanent, reliable army of citizen soldiers ready to respond quickly to revolts and external threats. The need for constant vigilance pushed Sparta toward a system in which every full citizen, the Spartiates, was expected to be a trained warrior first and everything else second. Instead of summoning farmers to short seasonal campaigns, the city began to shape an elite corps whose entire way of life revolved around readiness for war and internal control. The Messenian issue turned military organization from a tool of policy into the foundation of the state's survival. Social structure hardened accordingly. At the top stood the Spartiates, full citizens with political rights and the obligation to fight in the front ranks. Below them, the perioikoi, dwellers around, were free but not full citizens, communities that handled trade, craftsmanship, and many economic functions while providing auxiliary troops when required. At the bottom were the helots, bound to the soil, farming the land that sustained Spartan citizens. This three-tiered system existed in some form before Sparta's reputation as the ultimate warrior society, but its tensions and dependencies were precisely what pushed the polis toward deeper militarization over time. In this earlier period, before the agoge took its classic form, Spartan society still resembled other Greek communities in many ways. Families lived with their children. Men combined agricultural responsibilities with politics and occasional campaigns, and cultural life included poetry, music, and religious festivals. Spartans already valued toughness and courage, but these virtues had not yet swallowed every other aspect of life. The city was on a path toward militarization, not yet at its destination. Stories of early Spartan kings and lawgivers reflect debate and experimentation more than a fully crystallized system. The first traditions of training emerged as practical responses to constant danger. Young men were encouraged to hunt, exercise, and endure hardship so they could serve effectively in the citizen army. Communal meals and simple clothing reinforced solidarity and equality among those allowed into the citizen body. Over time, these practices grew more formal and demanding, gradually moving toward the systematic, state-directed education that would later be known as the agoge. What began as customs became rules. What began as expectations became obligations backed by law and public pressure. The transition to a fully militarized state was not a single decision, but a series of adaptations to recurring crises, helot unrest, external enemies, and internal power struggles. Each time Sparta faced danger, the answer tended to be more discipline, more control, more emphasis on collective readiness. Political institutions, from the dual kingship to the Council of Elders and Assembly, evolved alongside this shift, increasingly focused on maintaining a narrow, homogeneous citizen elite capable of living permanently under arms. Slowly, the balance tipped. Sparta's identity as a community of farmers and aristocrats gave way to a self-image rooted almost entirely in being warriors. By the time the rest of Greece began to speak of Spartans as the ultimate soldiers, the transformation was effectively complete. A society that had remade itself around the fear of internal revolt and external defeat. But behind that image lay centuries of evolution, compromise, and hard choices. The famous warrior culture was not an ancient constant. It was a constructed answer to a very specific problem. And the next step in that construction would begin in childhood, when Spartan boys were taken from their families and thrown into a system designed to break and rebuild them in the image the state demanded. At the age of 7, a Spartan boy's life as a son ended, and his life as property of the state began. Taken from his family, he entered the agoge, the state-run training system that would shape every instinct, habit, and belief he possessed. From that moment, the bonds that mattered most were no longer blood and home, but rank, age group, and the collective. The separation was not a side effect of training. It was the first lesson. A Spartan warrior could not belong to himself or to his parents. He belonged to Sparta, and Sparta would decide whether he lived, how he lived, and what he died for. Physical training and austerity formed the daily environment of the agoge. The boys were underfed on purpose, forced to move barefoot, and given a single cloak each year to endure cold and heat alike. They ran, wrestled, fought, jumped, and marched as routine, with little comfort and less privacy. Hardship was not punishment for failure. It was the baseline. The goal was to make the body a tool that could be driven beyond fatigue, hunger, and pain. Because a Spartan hoplite might one day need to stand in a shield wall when every natural instinct screamed to break and run. Punishments were frequent, brutal, and often public. Beatings were used not just to correct mistakes, but to test endurance and enforce absolute obedience. A boy who cried out under the lash brought shame on himself and his group. The famous endurance tests could include floggings at sanctuaries, where boys were whipped in front of onlookers until some collapsed or even died. Surviving such ordeals with stoic silence was praised as proof of character. Showing weakness invited ridicule and harsher treatment. The line between discipline and cruelty was thin, and the agoge consciously walked it. Combat training grew from rough play into systematic instruction. Wrestling, boxing, and pancration taught boys how to break, choke, and disable opponents at close quarters. They learned to use the spear and shield not as isolated weapons, but as parts of a formation. How to align, push, and strike in tune with others. Drills repeated endlessly: advance, lock shields, thrust, withdraw, pivot. Even mock fights were conducted in groups, with the idea that a Spartan never fought alone. Victory in battle would depend on each man holding his position as a living piece of a larger war machine. Violence and survival were constant contexts, not occasional themes. Boys were encouraged, even expected, to steal food, but punished severely if caught. The lesson was clear. Cunning and resourcefulness were virtues, failure and carelessness were not. Some sources suggest that older youths were sent on nocturnal expeditions against helots, both as terror tactics and as training in stealth and killing. Whether every detail of these accounts is exact or not, the underlying reality is hard to ignore. The agoge normalized living on the edge of hunger, fear, and danger so that war would feel like an extension of everyday life. Psychological formation was as deliberate as physical training. From early on, boys were taught to speak briefly and sharply, to endure insults without complaint, and to accept commands without hesitation. Songs, stories, and public praise all glorified obedience to laws and collective discipline rather than individual glory. The ideal Spartan did not ask why when ordered. He asked only how far or how long. The famous expectation to return with your shield or on it was not just a poetic line. It expressed an entire mindset in which survival meant nothing if it came at the cost of abandoning one's place in the line. Social relationships inside the agoge were carefully shaped to reinforce this obedience. Boys trained and lived in age cohorts, competing fiercely with other groups for honor in contests, inspections, and public evaluations. Older youths sometimes served as mentors or controllers for younger ones, both protecting and policing them. Bonds of loyalty, admiration, and fear grew in these hierarchies. A boy's identity became inseparable from his group. Shame for one could mean shame for all. At the same time, these relationships created informal networks that would later structure units in the battlefield and factions in Spartan politics. As they approached adulthood, the most promising young men entered more specialized stages. They might serve as assistants in mess groups, learning the rituals and expectations of adult citizens. They took part in more complex tactical exercises, including coordinated maneuvers and mock battles that simulated the confusion of real combat. Gradually, weapons training shifted from controlled drills to scenarios demanding quick decisions under pressure. The question was no longer whether they could endure pain, but whether they could keep formation and obey orders when fear and adrenaline surged. The passage from boy to full soldier was less a single ceremony than a series of thresholds. Obtaining a place in a common mess, secession, was crucial. Without it, a man could not become a full citizen soldier. Participation required contributions of food from helot worked estates and the acceptance of existing members. When a young man finally took his place among the men at these communal meals, he crossed from training into the permanent, lifelong status of a Spartan warrior. The agoge ended, but the discipline it had carved into him continued through daily routines, inspections, and expectations of constant readiness. By then, the child, who had once clung to his mother at age 7, was almost unrecognizable. In his place stood someone who had learned to endure hunger without complaint, pain without cry, fear without retreat. He had been taught that his own life mattered less than the stability of the line, the survival of Sparta, and the judgment of his peers. The cost of producing such a person in broken bodies, suppressed emotions, and normalized brutality was immense. But to Spartan leaders, that cost was the price of maintaining a tiny ruling class over a much larger, resentful population. Yet even this forged product of the agoge was only one piece of a larger structure. Outside the training grounds waited the communal messes, the political assemblies, the watch over helots, and the constant tension between privilege and fear. The next step was to understand how an entire society could be built to keep men like him always ready for war, and always afraid of what would happen if they ever stopped being warriors. Spartan society turned the citizen into a soldier, not just through training, but through every structure of daily life. A full Spartan citizen, the Spartiate, was at once a warrior, a political actor, and a symbol of the state's power. He fought in the front line as a hoplite, sat in assembly to vote on war and policy, and served as a living reminder that only a narrow elite had the right to bear arms and rule. Military service was not a phase of life. It was the permanent condition of citizenship. A Spartiate who failed to maintain his status as a warrior risked losing not just honor, but political rights and social standing. The political system that framed this life combined monarchy, oligarchy, and limited popular participation. Sparta had two kings, drawn from two royal houses, who led armies and performed religious functions, but their power was checked by the Gerousia, Council of Elders, and overseers known as ephors. The assembly of citizens could shout approval or rejection of proposals, especially on matters of war and peace, yet real agenda setting remained in elite hands. This balance of institutions did not aim at broad participation. It aimed at keeping the warrior elite unified and focused, preventing any single man from turning the army into a personal tool, and ensuring decisions favored stability over experimentation. Citizenship was inseparable from land. A Spartiate's identity rested on his clerus, the allotment of land worked by helots that financed his life as a full-time soldier. He did not farm it himself. Instead, he lived largely in town, training, eating in common messes, and being available for campaigns or internal control. If he lost the ability to contribute to his mess group because his estate failed or his helots were lost, he risked losing his status. Thus, the bond between citizen and land was both material and political. The land made his military existence possible, and his military existence justified his claim to land and power. Community life enforced discipline beyond the battlefield. Adult Spartiates ate their main meals in Syssitia, common messes where food, conversation, and evaluation mixed in a constant social check. Attendance was mandatory. Eating privately at home was considered suspicious, even un-Spartan. These communal meals reinforced equality among citizens while also acting as a daily inspection. Any sign of softness, excess, or deviation from norms could be noticed and criticized. Daily routines included exercise, inspections, and continual observation by elders and peers. In such an environment, discipline was not just external coercion, it was internalized through constant scrutiny. Spartan women held a kind of power unusual in the Greek world. They did not fight in battle, but they managed estates, directed helot labor, and supervised the upbringing of children in early years. Because men were often away or fully occupied with communal duties, women became the practical managers of property and household affairs. They also participated in physical training, on the logic that strong mothers produced strong sons. Their famous sharp tongues and public confidence were not accidents. The society expected them to reinforce martial values, shaming cowardice and praising bravery. Their influence helped ensure that the warrior ethic was taught at home long before the agoge took boys away. Beneath this citizen world lay the vast foundation of helot labor. Helots worked the land, produced food, and absorbed the burdens that in other polis fell on citizen farmers. Without them, Spartiates could not have devoted themselves entirely to military life. But this convenience came with constant fear. Helots vastly outnumbered their masters, and any sign of weakness might invite revolt. Periodic terror campaigns, secret police actions, and legal mechanisms kept helots in a state of intimidation. The entire Spartan system can be seen as a response to this reality. Citizens had to be permanently ready because their society sat on a volcano of resentment. The laws attributed to Lycurgus, whether he was a real person or a constructed figure, functioned as a kind of constitutional myth that justified and stabilized this order. These laws supposedly forbade luxury, mandated common meals, structured education, and locked in the division between citizens, perioikoi, and helots. Whether introduced all at once or gradually, they were remembered as a single package that gave Sparta its distinctive character. The story of Lycurgus served as a legend of origin, a wise lawgiver who had turned a troubled community into a disciplined force, binding citizens by oath to preserve his system unchanged. That myth discouraged reform and framed resistance to change as betrayal of ancestral law. All these elements, political structure, land relations, communal discipline, the role of women, helot oppression, and sacred law, fed directly into the military machine. Citizens whose identities were tied to land they did not work, watched by peers, praised by mothers for courage and shamed for weakness, living under laws that glorified austerity and obedience, became ideal hoplites for the system Sparta wanted. The line between civilian and soldier blurred until it effectively vanished. Sparta was not a city with an army. It was an army with a city attached to it, but a system built so tightly around control and rigidity carried hidden weaknesses. What would happen when external pressures changed, when enemies adapted, or when the number of citizen soldiers began to shrink? The answer lay in how Spartans fought, and in the gap between the myth of their invincibility and the real limits of their hoplite warfare. The real Spartan hoplite formation was not a mystical brotherhood charging half-naked into battle, but a tightly organized wall of bronze, wood, and flesh built on years of coordinated drill. Each warrior stood shoulder to shoulder with his comrades in ranks, several men deep, typically 8 to 12 rows, holding a large circular shield called a hoplon on his left arm and a spear in his right. The front rank presented a continuous barrier of overlapping shields, while spear points projected forward at chest height, creating a lethal hedge that could gut horses and impale men who came too close. Behind them, successive ranks added weight, pressure, and replacement capacity. If a frontline fighter fell, the man behind stepped into his place immediately. Spartan phalanx tactics emphasized relentless forward momentum and the orthismos, the brutal push phase, where formations collided and each side tried to shove the other backward until one broke. This was not heroic dueling, but grinding collective violence. Men pressed shield to shield, stabbing over or around their barriers, stepping on the wounded, and relying entirely on the discipline of those beside and behind them. The phalanx worked because no single warrior could survive alone. Safety came from maintaining formation, matching pace with neighbors, and refusing to give ground even when exhausted or terrified. Spartans drilled this coordination endlessly, making the advance, wheel, and lockstep movements almost automatic. Discipline and coordination in battle were what separated Spartan hoplites from other Greek citizen soldiers. While most Greek poleis could field a phalanx, few maintained the constant training and instant obedience that Spartans did. Commands were transmitted by shouted orders, horn signals, or the steady beat of flutes that paced the march. Spartan warriors responded without hesitation, adjusting depth, shifting direction, or halting in perfect unison. Skills that required not just courage, but ingrained reflexes and absolute trust in commanders and comrades. On level, open ground, this made them nearly unbeatable in frontal engagements, as their cohesion allowed them to bring maximum force to bear, while enemy formations wavered or broke under pressure. The equipment they used was practical and heavy, not the stylized fantasy of modern media. A Spartan hoplite wore a bronze cuirass protecting his torso, greaves on his shins, and a helmet, often the Corinthian style, that covered most of his face, limiting vision and hearing, but offering substantial protection. His shield, the hoplon, weighed around 7 kilograms and was large enough to cover from chin to knee, though it left the right side more exposed, forcing reliance on the neighbor's shield for full protection. The primary weapon was the dory, a spear between 2 and 3 meters long, with an iron head and a bronze butt spike that could serve as a backup weapon if the shaft broke. If the spear failed entirely, he drew the xiphos, a short, double-edged sword designed for close-quarters stabbing. The psychology of hoplite combat was as important as the physical training. Standing in the phalanx meant accepting that survival depended entirely on collective discipline. Breaking formation to save yourself often meant dooming everyone around you. The front ranks faced the immediate horror of spear thrusts, the crush of shields, and blood spattering from wounded men, while those behind endured the psychological strain of waiting their turn, while hearing and smelling the carnage ahead. Spartans were conditioned from childhood to suppress panic, to interpret fear as a test rather than a reason to flee, and to associate honor entirely with holding position no matter the cost. The famous red cloaks helped. They masked blood, maintained uniformity, and turned each individual into an anonymous piece of a terrifying collective. But the phalanx had real exploitable weaknesses. It was vulnerable on rough or broken terrain, where maintaining tight formation became impossible. Even small obstacles could create gaps that enemies could exploit. The flanks were exposed and relatively undefended, making cavalry charges or rapid infantry envelopments extremely dangerous. Once the formation broke, heavily armored hoplites became easy targets, slow to run, unable to reform quickly, and cut down as they fled. Spartans also struggled with sieges, naval warfare, and any situation requiring tactical flexibility beyond the set-piece infantry clash. Their entire system optimized for one kind of battle. When faced with different challenges, they often had to rely on allies or adapt painfully. Strategic missions beyond Greek borders tested these limits. Spartans could dominate the Peloponnese through short, decisive campaigns, but prolonged operations far from home created problems. Their small citizen population meant they couldn't afford heavy casualties, and long absences risked helot revolts back in Laconia. When Spartans did campaign in distant territories, Asia Minor, Sicily, or northern Greece, they often brought perioikoi and helot auxiliaries to fill out numbers, but these troops lacked the training and commitment of full citizens. The famous discipline that made Spartans unstoppable in short bursts became a liability when campaigns dragged on and logistical strain mounted. Greek rivals described Spartan efficiency with a mixture of fear, respect, and resentment. Athenian writers acknowledged that Spartan hoplites were the standard against which all others were measured, praising their silence under orders, their willingness to die rather than retreat, and their terrifying uniformity. Theban and Argive commanders studied Spartan tactics obsessively, looking for weaknesses and adapting their own forces to counter Spartan strengths. Even enemies who defeated Spartans in specific battles, and there were several, rarely disputed that man for man in a straight phalanx clash on good ground. Spartans were the best heavy infantry in Greece, but best did not mean invincible, and the gap between reputation and reality would become painfully clear. The same rigid discipline that made Spartans so effective also made them predictable. The same narrow focus on hoplite warfare left them unable to adapt when enemies chose not to fight on Spartan terms, and the demographic fragility of a society that depended on a shrinking pool of full citizens meant that every battle, win or lose, brought them closer to a breaking point. The next test of that system would come at a place called Thermopylae, a narrow pass where 300 Spartans and King Leonidas would write themselves into legend. But what really happened there, and who really fought, would turn out to be far more complicated than the myth that followed. The Persian invasion of Greece in 480 BCE was not a clash of civilizations driven by abstract ideals, but a calculated imperial campaign. Xerxes Vine inherited from his father Darius a desire to punish Greek city-states for supporting rebellions in Ionia and to extend Persian dominance into Europe. His massive army, ancient sources inflate the numbers wildly, but modern estimates suggest around 100,000 to 200,000 soldiers, plus support personnel, advanced through northern Greece with the intention of forcing submission through overwhelming force. Greek polis faced a choice: resist together, negotiate separately, or submit. Most hedged, waiting to see which way power would flow. Sparta and Athens chose to lead a defensive coalition, but their alliance was fragile and their resources limited compared to the Persian juggernaut bearing down on them. The famous 300 Spartans were not a random selection, but the personal bodyguard of King Leonidas, chosen specifically because each had living sons to continue their family lines. This detail is crucial. Leonidas expected to die. The decision to send exactly 300 Spartiates reflected both military calculation and political reality. Sparta was in the middle of the Carneia, a religious festival that traditionally barred large-scale military campaigns. Sending a small royal guard allowed Leonidas to honor the festival technically, while still positioning Spartan leadership at the critical pass. The plan was never for 300 men to hold off Persia alone. It was to anchor a much larger Greek defensive coalition until reinforcements arrived. The presence of allied Greek forces is often minimized in popular retellings, but it was militarily essential. Leonidas commanded approximately 7,000 Greek hoplites total, including contingents from Thespiae, Thebes, Phocis, Locris, and other city-states. These allies held the line alongside the Spartans for most of the battle, sharing the exhaustion, terror, and bloodshed. The Thespians, in particular, refused to retreat, even when given the chance, and died fighting beside the Spartans in the final stand. The myth of 300 alone against millions erases these contributions, turning a coalition defensive action into a Spartan-only narrative that serves legend better than history. The strategy at Thermopylae was devastatingly simple. funnel the Persian army into a narrow coastal pass where numbers meant nothing and superior Greek armor and discipline could dominate. The pass was only a few meters wide in places, bordered by cliffs on one side and sea on the other, making it impossible for the Persians to deploy their cavalry or encircle the defenders. Wave after wave of Persian infantry, including the elite immortals, crashed into the Greek phalanx and were butchered by longer spears, heavier armor, and tighter formation. For 2 full days the Greeks held, inflicting horrific casualties while suffering relatively few themselves. The defensive position worked exactly as intended until it didn't. Helots played roles that ancient sources barely acknowledge, but which were logistically critical. Every Spartan hoplite brought helot attendants to carry supplies, maintain equipment, prepare food, and assist the wounded. These men were not armed for frontline combat, but their labor made the Spartan military presence possible. Some estimates suggest that the 300 Spartans actually meant 300 Spartiates, plus perhaps 900 to 1,200 helot attendants and servants accompanying the force. When the final stand came, many helots likely died alongside their masters, not out of loyalty necessarily, but because escape was impossible. Their deaths are rarely counted or mourned in the legends. The political decision that led to this suicidal stand was shaped by complex considerations beyond simple heroism. Sparta's leadership knew that abandoning the pass without a fight would shatter the fragile Greek coalition and embolden Persian sympathizers within Greece. A dramatic, honorable sacrifice could galvanize resistance, even in defeat. Leonidas was expendable in a way the full Spartan army was not. His death could serve a strategic purpose that his survival might not. The decision was calculated: lose a king and a small force to buy time, preserve the main army, and create a rallying cry that would stiffen Greek resolve for the battles to come. The final collapse came through betrayal, not battlefield failure. A local Greek named Ephialtes showed the Persians a mountain path that bypassed the pass, allowing them to attack the defenders from behind. When Leonidas learned of the encirclement, he dismissed most of the allied forces, keeping only the Spartans, Thespians, and possibly some Thebans, who may have been held as hostages or who chose to stay. In the last phase, surrounded and outnumbered, the Greeks fought with spears until they broke, then swords until they shattered, and finally fists, teeth, and rocks until every man fell. Leonidas died early in the final melee. The fight continued over his body until the Persians overwhelmed the position entirely. The battle was recorded first by Herodotus, writing decades after the events with access to both Greek survivors and Persian sources. His account mixed factual reporting with dramatic storytelling, emphasizing Spartan courage, Persian numbers, and the tragic inevitability of the Greek defeat. He preserved details, like the Spartan habit of combing their hair before battle, that became iconic elements of the legend. Later, Greek writers amplified the story, stripping away complexity to focus on sacrifice and heroism. The Thespians and Helots faded from the narrative. The 300 Spartans became the sole heroes, their stand transformed from a strategic delaying action into a mythic last stand against impossible odds. The myth grew because it served emotional and political needs that transcended historical accuracy. Athens needed to show that Greeks could stand against Persia. Sparta needed to justify its leadership of the Greek coalition. Later generations needed stories of courage when facing their own crises. Thermopylae became a symbol, a small, disciplined force, choosing death over surrender, honor over survival, collective duty over individual safety. The story was retold in Roman times, during medieval crusades, in modern nationalist movements, and finally in Hollywood blockbusters, each era reshaping it to reflect contemporary values and anxieties. What actually happened at Thermopylae was extraordinary enough without exaggeration. A carefully chosen defensive position, a coalition of Greek forces buying time through disciplined resistance, and a calculated sacrifice that achieved its strategic purpose despite military defeat. Leonidas and his 300 Spartiates anchored that stand, but they were neither alone nor operating from pure heroism. They were executing a plan shaped by politics, religion, and military necessity. Yet even as the myth of Thermopylae spread, the real Sparta continued to function as a complex, often contradictory society. The victory that truly saved Greece would come at sea, at Salamis, where Spartan contributions were minimal. The war would be won not by hoplite courage alone, but by the Athenian navy. Persian logistical failures and Greek unity maintained just barely long enough to outlast the invasion. Thermopylae mattered, but not in the way the legend suggests. And the Sparta that emerged from the Persian Wars would soon reach the height of its power, a golden age built on the reputation earned in that narrow pass, but sustained by the brutal social system that had made such sacrifice possible in the first place. Spartan hegemony over Greece reached its peak in the decades following the Peloponnesian War, when Sparta emerged as the dominant military and political force in the Greek world. After defeating Athens in 404 BCE, Sparta dismantled the Athenian Empire, installed friendly oligarchic governments across former Athenian allies, and claimed the role of protector of Greek freedom that Athens had once held. For a brief, shining moment, Spartan power seemed unchallengeable. Its armies had crushed the greatest naval empire in Greek history. Its reputation intimidated rivals into submission, and its alliance system stretched from the Peloponnese to the Aegean Islands. Military dominance in Greece was enforced through a combination of direct intervention and the threat of Spartan hoplites appearing wherever rebellions stirred. Sparta positioned garrisons in key cities, sent out military governors called harmosts to oversee subject states, and deployed its army ruthlessly to crush any challenge to its authority. The Peloponnesian League, Sparta's long-standing alliance network, expanded to include former Athenian territories, creating a sphere of influence that covered much of mainland Greece and parts of the Aegean. No Greek polis could match Sparta's infantry in open battle, and few dared to try during this period. Conquests and political alliances extended Spartan reach beyond traditional boundaries. Sparta even launched expeditions into Asia Minor, challenging Persian control over Greek cities in Anatolia with campaigns led by commanders like Agesilaus II. These ventures demonstrated Spartan ambition to position itself not just as a regional hegemon, but as a pan-Hellenic power capable of confronting the Persian Empire itself. At the same time, Sparta negotiated the controversial King's Peace of 386 BCE, which acknowledged Persian control over Anatolian Greeks in exchange for Persian support of Spartan dominance in mainland Greece. This cynical deal revealed that Sparta's rhetoric about defending Greek freedom was secondary to maintaining its own power. Internal reforms and tightened social control accompanied external expansion. Spartan leaders became more concerned with managing an empire than simply maintaining their traditional society. Wealth began flowing into Sparta from tribute, plunder, and subject territories, a development that started to undermine the austere equality that had supposedly defined Spartan citizenship. At the same time, the state doubled down on Helot control, using its military strength to suppress any sign of unrest among the oppressed population whose labor sustained the system. The Krypteia, Sparta's secret police force that targeted potential Helot rebels, operated with increased ruthlessness during this period. Campaigns in the Peloponnese reinforced Sparta's regional dominance, but also created resentment among Greek states that had once been allies, not subjects. The Battle of Mantinea in 418 BCE had already reasserted Spartan control over the Peloponnese during the Peloponnesian War, crushing an Argive-led coalition that had challenged Spartan leadership. After Athens fell, Sparta treated even its wartime allies harshly, keeping tribute revenues for itself while forcing others to accept Spartan garrisons and political interference. This behavior bred quiet fury among cities like Thebes and Corinth, which had sacrificed heavily to defeat Athens, only to find themselves dominated by an even more overbearing hegemon. The education system reached its apex during this period, producing warriors whose discipline and skill were recognized throughout the Greek world. The agoge functioned at peak efficiency, churning out Spartiate hoplites who embodied the ideal of the collective soldier, obedient, tough, skilled in formation fighting, and willing to die for the state. Foreign observers came to Sparta to study its training methods, and Greek military theorists acknowledged Spartan superiority in producing professional infantry. The system seemed to vindicate itself. Here was proof that total militarization, however harsh, created the best soldiers in Greece. International prestige of Spartan warriors stood at its highest point. To be called Spartiate carried weight across the Mediterranean. Spartan advisors were sought by foreign powers, Spartan mercenaries commanded premium rates, and Spartan leadership in military coalitions was accepted almost without question. The reputation built at Thermopylae, Plataea, and throughout the Peloponnesian War now translated into political capital. Sparta's voice in pan-Hellenic affairs carried authority that Athens at its height had never quite achieved, because Spartan power rested on unquestioned military dominance rather than commercial wealth or democratic ideals, yet the seeds of decline were already germinating within this apparent triumph. The Spartiate population, full citizens capable of serving as hoplites, began a slow but relentless decline that would prove fatal. Battlefield casualties from decades of nearly continuous warfare, concentrated land ownership that pushed some citizens below the threshold needed to maintain their status, and a falling birth rate all combined to shrink the pool of qualified warriors. Where Sparta once fielded thousands of Spartiate hoplites, numbers began dropping toward hundreds. The system had no mechanism to expand citizenship or incorporate new members at scale. It could only contract. The empire Sparta acquired demanded resources and attention that the traditional Spartan system couldn't provide. Spartan citizens were trained to stand in phalanx and obey orders, not to govern distant territories, manage complex logistics, or navigate the diplomatic intricacies of a far-flung hegemony. Commanders like Lysander gained experience and ambition from foreign campaigns, returning to Sparta with wealth, personal followings, and political agendas that threatened the rigid equality the system supposedly maintained. Internal dissent and political infighting increased as successful generals clashed with conservative elders over how to manage the empire and how much change Sparta could tolerate without losing its identity. The arrogance of power led Sparta to overreach repeatedly. Interventions in the affairs of allies, harsh treatment of defeated enemies, and the cynical betrayal of Greek freedom in Asia Minor all created coalitions of resentful enemies waiting for any sign of Spartan weakness. The Corinthian War, 395–387 BCE, saw Athens, Thebes, Corinth, and Argos unite against Sparta, forcing years of brutal fighting that further drained Spartan manpower. Though Sparta eventually prevailed with Persian support, the war demonstrated that its hegemony rested on fragile foundations. As long as Greek states remained divided, Sparta dominated, but any serious coalition could challenge it effectively. The contradiction at the heart of Spartan society became more glaring during this hegemonic period. A system built on rigid conservatism and limited citizenship could not sustain an empire requiring flexibility, expansion, and administrative sophistication. Sparta's greatest strength, the focused, disciplined militarization of its citizen body, became its greatest weakness when circumstances demanded something other than hoplite warfare. The polis that had perfected one type of military excellence found itself unable to adapt when the rules of power politics changed, and change was coming faster than Sparta could respond. In Thebes, a new generation of commanders was studying Spartan tactics obsessively, looking for the weaknesses others had missed. In Macedonia, A kingdom Sparta had barely noticed was reforming its army under Philip II, creating a military system that would combine phalanx depth with cavalry shock and tactical flexibility. The Spartan moment of absolute dominance would prove brief, lasting barely 3 decades before the entire structure came crashing down in a single afternoon on a battlefield in Boeotia. The question Sparta's leaders failed to ask during their golden age was simple but fatal. What happens when the supply of Spartiate warriors runs out before the need for them does? The answer was approaching, and it would shatter the myth of Spartan invincibility forever. The battle that broke Spartan invincibility happened on July the 6th, 371 BCE, at Leuctra in Boeotia, when a Theban army under Epaminondas shattered the myth that Spartan hoplites could not be beaten in open battle. The Thebans deployed a revolutionary tactic, massing their best troops 50 ranks deep on their left wing, creating an enormous battering ram of human force that smashed through the Spartan right where King Cleombrotus and the elite Spartiate warriors stood. The Spartans, expecting the traditional phalanx clash, found themselves overwhelmed by concentrated weight and momentum they had never faced before. Cleombrotus died in the melee, along with roughly 400 of the 700 Spartiates present, a catastrophic loss representing more than half of Sparta's remaining full citizens in the field. The survivors fled, the first time in memory that a Spartan phalanx had broken and run. The aura of invincibility vanished in a single afternoon. The loss of citizen soldiers accelerated into a demographic crisis that Sparta could not reverse. Centuries of warfare, rigid citizenship requirements, and concentrated land ownership had already reduced the Spartiate population from perhaps 8,000 adult males in the mid-5th century to fewer than 2,500 by the time of Leuctra. After that battle, the numbers fell even further. Each dead Spartiate was irreplaceable. The Agoge could only produce new warriors from existing citizen families, and there was no mechanism to expand the citizenship base by incorporating perioikoi, freed helots or foreigners. Sparta's military strength rested entirely on a shrinking pool of qualified hoplites, and every battle, won or lost, brought the total closer to unsustainable levels. Economic instability deepened as the traditional system broke under pressures it had never been designed to handle. The wealth flowing into Sparta from its brief hegemony had undermined the austere equality that supposedly bound citizens together. Some Spartiates accumulated land and resources, while others fell below the threshold of contributions required to maintain citizenship and were demoted to inferiors. The concentration of wealth in fewer hands meant fewer full citizens capable of equipping themselves as hoplites and participating in the communal messes. The rigid system that had once produced uniform warriors now created increasing inequality and resentment, with no legal or social mechanisms to correct the imbalance without abandoning the entire Lycurgan framework. Dependence on helot labor became utterly unsustainable after Leuctra. Epaminondas followed his victory by invading Laconia and liberating Messenia, freeing thousands of helots and establishing an independent Messenian state backed by Theban military power. This was a mortal blow. Sparta lost roughly half its agricultural base and the labor force that had made the Spartiate lifestyle possible. Without Messenian helots working the land, many citizen estates could no longer produce the contributions required for mess participation, pushing more Spartiates into economic failure and loss of citizenship. The entire social structure rested on a foundation that was suddenly pulled away, leaving Sparta without the resources to sustain its warrior class, even if the population had remained stable. Social changes corroded the system from within, even as external defeats mounted. Spartan commanders and officials who had served abroad during the hegemony returned with new ideas, personal ambitions, and wealth that disrupted traditional hierarchies. Some questioned whether the old ways still worked in a changed world. Others clung desperately to the Lycurgan ideal, even as reality made it increasingly fictional. Attempts to enforce traditional austerity while obvious inequality grew created cynicism and hypocrisy. The ideological cohesion that had once bound Spartiates together as a unified warrior elite fractured into factions, with reformers arguing for change and conservatives insisting that any deviation would complete the collapse. Military discipline showed cracks that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Spartan armies now included fewer actual Spartiates and more perioikoi, freed helots pressed into service, and mercenaries hired to fill gaps in the phalanx. These troops lacked the lifelong training and ideological commitment of traditional Spartiate hoplites. Coordination suffered, obedience became less automatic, and the seamless unit cohesion that had made Spartan phalanxes superior began to deteriorate. Commanders could no longer assume that orders would be executed flawlessly, that men would hold formation under extreme pressure, or that the line would never break. The military edge Sparta had spent centuries developing eroded rapidly once the human material it depended on changed. Internal attempts at restoration tried desperately to reverse the decline, but achieved little. Kings Agis IV and Cleomenes III, ruling in the late 3rd century BCE, attempted radical reforms, cancelling debts, redistributing land, and expanding citizenship to restore Spartiate numbers and military capability. Both were ultimately defeated. Agis executed by conservative elders, Cleomenes driven into exile after initial military successes. The entrenched interests that benefited from the status quo proved too powerful, even as that status quo guaranteed Sparta's continued decline. The very rigidity that had made Sparta strong now made it incapable of adapting to survive. The end of Spartan hegemony came not with a single dramatic collapse, but through a series of humiliations that reduced Sparta from hegemon to regional power to irrelevance. After Leuctra, Thebes dominated Greek affairs for a decade. When Theban power faded, Sparta lacked the strength to reclaim leadership. The rise of Macedon under Philip II and Alexander the Great created a new order in which Sparta was simply bypassed, too weak to matter, too proud to submit, clinging to memories of past glory while the Greek world moved on without them. By the time Rome absorbed Greece, Sparta was a tourist attraction, a living museum where wealthy Romans came to watch reenactments of ancient customs performed by people who could barely remember why they mattered. Yet even as Sparta faded into political insignificance, something strange happened. The myth of Sparta grew stronger, not weaker. The reality of a failed, brutal, ultimately self-destructive social experiment was forgotten or ignored, replaced by an idealized image of perfect warriors and flawless discipline. The question is why and how a society that collapsed so completely could become one of history's most powerful symbols. The answer lies not in what Sparta was, but in what later civilizations needed it to be. The romanticization of Sparta began even while the city-state still held power, with rival Greeks creating an idealized image that bore only partial resemblance to reality. Athenian philosophers like Plato and Xenophon praised Sparta as a model of order, discipline, and freedom from the corruptions of commerce and democracy. They saw in Sparta an alternative to Athenian chaos, a state where virtue was enforced, where citizens lived simply and devoted themselves to the common good rather than private enrichment. This philosophical admiration conveniently ignored the brutal oppression of helots, the rigid conformity that crushed individuality, and the fact that Spartan virtue rested on a foundation of slavery and terror. Even Athenians, who fought against Sparta politically, couldn't resist the appeal of an imagined Spartan ideal. Political use of the Spartan myth began almost immediately after Sparta's decline. When Rome absorbed Greece, Sparta had become a tourist attraction where wealthy Romans came to watch young men endure ritual whippings and reenact ancient customs. Roman elites used Sparta as a moral lesson. proof that discipline and austerity produced greatness, and that luxury and decadence led to decline. Conservative Roman politicians invoked Spartan values when arguing against reforms or defending traditional hierarchies. The real Sparta, with all its contradictions and failures, mattered far less than the symbolic Sparta that could be deployed in contemporary debates. Medieval and Renaissance reinterpretations added new layers to the myth. European aristocrats and military theorists rediscovered Sparta through classical texts and imagined it as an early version of their own warrior nobility, a society where breeding, training, and honor produced perfect soldiers. Renaissance humanists debated Spartan governance, some seeing it as a model of mixed constitution, balancing monarchical, aristocratic, and democratic elements. The fact that these interpretations contradicted each other mattered little. Sparta had become a mirror in which each era could see whatever virtues or warnings it needed. Modern military thinkers adopted Sparta as a model for creating disciplined professional soldiers. Prussian military academies studied Spartan training methods, looking for ways to instill absolute obedience and unit cohesion. 20th century totalitarian regimes found Sparta especially appealing. Here was a society that subordinated the individual entirely to the state, that glorified military service above all else, and that maintained racial purity through rigid hierarchies. The fact that Sparta ultimately failed didn't diminish its appeal to ideologues who believed they could perfect what the ancients had only begun. Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy both invoked Spartan imagery and values, seeing themselves as modern inheritors of warrior discipline and collective purpose. Hollywood's portrayal of Sparta, particularly in the 2006 film 300, created a global pop culture phenomenon that reshaped how millions understood ancient history. The film presented Spartans as nearly superhuman warriors, muscled, fearless, fighting for freedom against Persian tyranny. It ignored or minimized the role of allied Greek forces at Thermopylae, exaggerated Persian numbers and barbarism, and created a visual aesthetic that prioritized spectacle over accuracy. The Spartans appeared as lone defenders of Western civilization, a narrative that resonated with contemporary anxieties about cultural conflict and civilizational identity. The film's massive success, both commercial and cultural, meant that for an entire generation, this stylized, historically questionable version became the real Sparta in popular imagination. Misinformation and exaggeration spread through this pop culture dominance. Audiences came away believing that 300 Spartans fought entirely alone, that they wore minimal armor and fought bare-chested, that the Agoge produced superhuman soldiers through pure toughness, and that Spartan society was a meritocratic warrior culture rather than an oppressive oligarchy built on slavery. Social media and motivational content amplified these myths further, using Spartan imagery to sell everything from fitness programs to political ideologies. The lambda shield, the red cloak, and the laconic phrase, "come and take them," became symbols divorced from historical context, available for anyone to claim as representing discipline, toughness, or resistance to tyranny. Contemporary fascination with stoic, Spartan values reflects modern anxieties more than ancient realities. Online communities celebrate Spartan warrior mindset, emphasizing mental toughness, emotional control, and the rejection of modern softness. These narratives present Sparta as an antidote to perceived cultural weakness, a model of how men should be: hard, disciplined, focused on excellence through suffering. The irony is that modern admirers cherry-pick elements that appeal while ignoring aspects that would horrify them. The total subordination of individuals to state control, the acceptance of pederastic relationships in military training, the systematic brutalization of children, and the utter dependence on enslaved labor. The conflict between myth and historical reality creates genuine scholarly and cultural problems. Historians face audiences primed by films, video games, and motivational memes to reject complexity in favor of simple narratives about warrior excellence. Attempts to explain that the agog included no actual weapons training, that Spartan military effectiveness was often mediocre, or that the society was fundamentally oppressive and unsustainable meet resistance from people emotionally invested in the myth. The romantic version of Sparta serves psychological and ideological needs that historical accuracy cannot fulfill. It offers a fantasy of perfect discipline, clear purpose, and glory earned through suffering that many find deeply appealing in an uncertain world. This tension won't resolve because the myth and the reality serve different purposes. Academic history aims to understand what actually happened and why. Popular culture and political rhetoric need symbols, archetypes, and stories that inspire or warn. Sparta functions brilliantly as a symbol precisely because it's distant enough that people can project onto it without confronting uncomfortable specifics. A genuinely accurate portrayal of Sparta, including the child abuse, the sexual dynamics of the agog, the paranoid oppression of helots, the demographic collapse, and the ultimate failure, would make it far less useful as a motivational symbol or political model. Yet the power of the Spartan myth reveals something important about how societies remember and use the past. Every culture creates mythologized versions of history that serve present needs, simplifying complexity into narratives that reinforce values, justify policies, or inspire action. Sparta is simply one of the most successful examples of this process. A society that achieved in death and memory what it could never sustain in life: immortality. The real Spartans died, their system collapsed, and their city became a Roman theme park. But the idea of Sparta lives on, endlessly remade, to fit new contexts and serve new purposes. So what finally made the historical Spartans truly unique? Not the myth, but the actual people who lived and died under that brutal system. And can anything genuinely valuable be extracted from their experience without falling into the trap of romanticizing oppression and failure? The collective discipline achieved by Sparta exceeded anything comparable ancient societies produced, creating a level of unit cohesion and coordinated action that astonished even experienced military observers. While other Greek polis could field citizen militias that fought bravely, Spartan hoplites moved as a single organism, advancing, wheeling, and responding to commands with mechanical precision born from decades of synchronized training. This wasn't individual heroism, but something more unsettling: the near-total suppression of individual judgment in favor of collective response. A Spartan phalanx didn't contain 300 or 700 individual warriors making independent decisions. It functioned as one entity with hundreds of limbs, each moving in perfect concert with the others. The symbiosis between state, warfare, and private life created a social structure unparalleled in antiquity. In Athens or Corinth, war was one aspect of civic life alongside commerce, politics, arts, and philosophy. In Sparta, war wasn't an activity, it was the framework within which every other activity occurred. A Spartan's worth was measured by military contribution. His political rights depended on warrior status. His social relationships formed through military training and communal messes, and even his family life was structured to produce more warriors. There was no civilian sphere distinct from military identity. The two were completely fused. A Spartan couldn't separate his identity as a person from his role as a soldier any more than he could separate his body from his shadow. The donation of the individual to the collective began in childhood and continued until death. From age 7 onward, a Spartan boy learned that his preferences, comfort, and even survival mattered only insofar as they served the group. The agog systematically broke down the psychological boundaries between self and unit, replacing individual identity with collective identity. By adulthood, the question, "What do I want?" became almost meaningless. The only relevant question was, "What does Sparta need?" This produced warriors who would hold impossible positions, endure unthinkable hardships, and die without complaint. not from individual courage, but from an identity so thoroughly reconstructed that abandoning the collective felt like self-annihilation. The ritualization of war as social duty, rather than occasional necessity, transformed how Spartans understood violence. In most societies, war is recognized as a terrible but sometimes necessary disruption of normal life. Sparta inverted this. Peace was the disruption, the dangerous state where discipline might soften and readiness might slip. Military training wasn't preparation for war, it was life itself. Battle wasn't an extraordinary event, but the fulfillment of purpose, the moment when years of training achieved meaning. This ritualization meant that warfare carried almost religious significance. Warriors weren't simply fighting for territory or resources, but performing sacred duties that connected them to ancestors and gods. Psychological training achieved depths that modern special forces programs might recognize, but civilian societies find disturbing. The systematic exposure to pain, hunger, and fear during the agoge wasn't sadism for its own sake, but deliberate psychological conditioning. Spartans learned to interpret physical suffering as normal rather than emergency, to override survival instincts that would make most humans break or flee, and to function effectively even when every biological impulse screamed to stop. The constant public evaluation, the shame culture that made cowardice worse than death, and the total absence of privacy created psychological architecture that could withstand pressures that shattered normal human beings. The social structure based on domination created a paradox. Spartans were simultaneously privileged oppressors and oppressed tools of state control. They lived far better than helots and exercised life and death power over the subject population, yet their own lives were rigidly controlled from childhood to death, with virtually no personal autonomy, no opportunity to pursue individual interests, and no escape from collective demands. This dual status, masters over others but slaves to the system, created a psychology that was simultaneously arrogant and deeply insecure. Spartans knew their entire way of life depended on keeping helots terrorized and rivals intimidated, that any sign of weakness could trigger collapse. Cultural identity centered entirely on war in ways that went beyond profession to become almost a religion. Spartan myths, songs, rituals, and public celebrations all glorified military excellence and collective sacrifice. Mothers famously told sons to return with your shield or on it, meaning victorious or dead. Surrender or cowardice were worse than death. This cultural messaging was relentless and omnipresent, reinforced through peer pressure, public honors, and communal rituals that made warrior identity inseparable from being Spartan at all. The result was a society that successfully convinced its members that dying well in battle was not just honorable, but the only meaningful way to validate one's existence. They remain global icons because the Spartan model addresses enduring human anxieties about chaos, weakness, and the challenge of creating order through collective action. In every era plagued by uncertainty, social disorder, external threats, or cultural anxiety about softness, Sparta resurfaces as a symbol of what pure discipline and collective purpose can achieve. Modern military organizations study Spartan unit cohesion. Fitness culture borrows Spartan imagery to sell toughness, and political movements invoke Spartan values when arguing for hierarchy, sacrifice, and collective purpose over individual rights. The myth persists because humans repeatedly face the question, how do you turn individuals into coordinated groups capable of achieving difficult goals? Sparta represents the extreme answer, total subordination of individual to collective, achieved through systematic conditioning from earliest childhood. What made Spartans truly unique wasn't any single element, but the completeness of their system's integration. Other societies had professional soldiers, warrior cultures, rigorous training, or collective values. Sparta combined all these elements into a totalizing system where every aspect of life reinforced every other aspect. creating feedback loops that produced extraordinary military capability at extraordinary human cost. The agoge produced men perfectly adapted to the phalanx. The phalanx justified the agoge's brutality, the communal messes maintained discipline between campaigns, the helot system freed citizens for constant military readiness, and the entire structure was defended by ideology that made any alternative seem like betrayal of ancestral virtue. This completeness was simultaneously Sparta's greatest achievement and its fatal flaw. The system worked brilliantly as long as all variables remained constant. Enough Spartiates to maintain control, enough helots to provide labor, enough military success to justify sacrifices, and enemies who fought the kind of battles Spartans had optimized for. But when any variable changed, demographic decline, helot liberation, tactical innovation by enemies, or economic disruption, the integrated system couldn't adapt without potentially destroying itself. Reforms that might have saved Sparta required abandoning Lycurgan principles, but abandoning those principles meant ceasing to be Sparta. The society had become so perfectly adapted to its specific niche that it couldn't survive when conditions changed. So the final question remains, was Sparta's experiment a success or a catastrophic failure? Did it prove that total militarization can create excellence, or demonstrate that societies built entirely around war inevitably collapse from their own contradictions? The answer depends on what you value, and that choice reveals more about the present than the past. The historical truth about Sparta surpasses the myth in every meaningful way. It's more human, more brutal, and ultimately more fascinating than any Hollywood version could capture. The real Spartans weren't superhuman warriors free from doubt or fear, but products of a totalizing system that broke children down and rebuilt them as instruments of state violence. They weren't defenders of freedom, but enforcers of one of antiquity's most oppressive social orders, built on the systematic terror of helots, who outnumbered their masters and lived under constant threat. Their military excellence came at a cost most modern societies would find morally unacceptable: the complete sacrifice of individual autonomy, childhood innocence, and basic human compassion in service of collective military capability. The Spartan legacy shaped how civilizations have thought about discipline, training, and military organization for over 2 millennia. Every society that has attempted to create elite military forces has looked back to Sparta as a reference point, sometimes as a model to emulate, other times as a warning about the costs of total militarization. The concept of subjecting warriors to rigorous, standardized training from youth, the emphasis on unit cohesion over individual heroism, and the integration of military identity with citizenship all trace intellectual lineage back to Spartan practices. Modern military academies, special forces selection processes, and even corporate team-building exercises echo Spartan principles, though usually in far diluted form. The question of how much individual freedom should be sacrificed for collective effectiveness remains as urgent today as it was in ancient Laconia. Understanding who the Spartans truly were helps separate glory from propaganda from historical reality, a distinction that matters profoundly in an era of historical myth-making and selective memory. The romanticized Sparta serves ideological purposes. It offers a fantasy of perfect order, clear purpose, and excellence achieved through discipline and sacrifice. The real Sparta reveals uncomfortable truths about what total militarization actually requires and ultimately produces: a society so rigid it cannot adapt, so specialized it cannot change, and so dependent on oppression that its foundation inevitably crumbles. Learning this history doesn't diminish the Spartans' genuine military achievements or the courage of individuals like Leonidas and his 300, but it contextualizes those achievements within a system that was as deeply flawed as it was effective, and ultimately failed despite everything it demanded from its people. The Spartans were neither the perfect warriors of legend nor simple villains, but something more complex: human beings trapped in a system that promised glory and delivered, for a time, military dominance, before the contradictions inherent in that system brought it crashing down. Their story is a warning, as much as an inspiration, proof that excellence in one domain cannot compensate for fundamental structural weaknesses, and that societies built entirely around war eventually discover that war alone cannot sustain civilization. If you want more history that goes beyond the myths to uncover what actually happened, the messy, complicated, fascinating truth behind legendary warriors and empires, subscribe to help us reach our goal, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from. Your support makes it possible to keep digging into the real stories history tried to simplify.